Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the Data Playbook. So, I just had the interesting video of the 1 o'clock ones before, where they just quickly flash through all the screens. But I think this time I'll go back to what I was doing before with just the 4 o'clock games. So, let's look at Tennessee at Vegas. So, here you have the Raiders favored on the money line with a spread of 4.5 and a total line of 41.5 points. Walking through the ranks, you have Tennessee with a passing rank of 30 and a rushing rank of 27, an allowed passing rank of 19, and an allowed rushing rank of 30. You have the Raiders with a passing rank of 15, a rushing rank of 19, an allowed passing rank of 20, and an allowed rushing rank of 13. The team averages are 175.8 passing yards per game for Tennessee and an average of 85 rushing yards per game. They've had 3 passing interceptions this season and on average take about 4 sacks per game. The Raiders average 235 passing yards per game and 112 rushing yards per game. They've had a total of 9 interceptions this season for an average of 1.8 interceptions per game, and on average they take 3.2 sacks per game. Defensively, Tennessee allows 231 passing yards per game and 146.8 rushing yards per game. The Raiders allow 233.8 passing yards per game and 101.4 rushing yards per game. Tennessee averages almost 5 QB hits per game, while the Raiders only average 4. They both average about the same amount of sacks per game at 1.6 and 1.4. And on the season, Tennessee has 3 interceptions, while the Raiders have gotten 2 interceptions. If we look into the quarterbacks, you have Cam Ward for Tennessee and Geno Smith for Vegas. Cam Ward has 36.8 fantasy points this season for an average of 7.3 per game. Geno Smith has 62.4 fantasy points this season for an average of 12.5 fantasy points per game. Cam Ward has 3 passing interceptions and suffered 19 sacks this season. He's also lost 2 fumbles. Geno Smith has 9 interceptions and has suffered 16 sacks this season. So we have Cam Ward at his 175.8 passing yards per game and on average rushes 7.2 yards per game. Geno Smith has 235.2 passing yards per game on average and rushes 14.8 yards per game on average. Here you have Cam Ward's best week was last week with 265 passing yards, and right before that his worst week with 108 passing yards. Geno Smith's best week was in week 1 with 362 passing yards, and his worst week was in week 4 with 117 passing yards. For your running backs, you have Tony Pollard for Tennessee and Ashton Gianti for the Raiders. Tony Pollard has gotten 47.4 fantasy points this season, or 56.4 in PPR. That's an average of 9.5 or 11.3 in PPR. GNT has 63.1 fantasy points this season, 75.1 in PPR. That's an average of 12.6 fantasy points, or 15 in PPR. Pollard has had 2 fumbles that he's lost, and GNT's had 1 fumble that he's lost. Pollard averages 65.6 rushing yards per game and 13.2 receiving yards per game, while GNT averages 69.8 rushing yards per game and 12.4 receiving yards per game. Pollard's best week was week 2 with 92 rushing yards, and his worst week was right after that with 45 rushing yards. Ashton's best week was week 4 with 138 rushing yards, and his worst week was week 1 with 38 rushing yards. And then looking at the top receivers, you have Calvin Ridley and Jacoby Myers. Calvin Ridley's had 27.2 fantasy points this season, 42.2 in PPR. That's an average of 5.5 or 8.5 in PPR. Jacoby Myers has 29 fantasy points this season, 54 in PPR. That's an average of 5.8 fantasy points, or 10.8 in PPR. Neither receiver has lost a fumble this season, and if we look at our averages, they're very close to each other, with Calvin Ridley having 54.4 receiving yards per game, and Jacoby Myers having 58 receiving yards per game. Calvin Ridley really had that boosted from last week with 131 receiving yards, because otherwise he's had about that 30 range for many of the games. Jacoby's best week came in week 1 with 97 receiving yards, and he's kind of fallen off over the last couple games with only about 30 receiving yards in each game. Both these players, though, as expected, get about the largest share of receiving yards for the team. And then just quickly looking at the tight ends, you have Chig, and I don't think I can say his last name correctly, and Michael Mayer, I think, because it looks like Brock Bowers is out. Chig has 17.2 fantasy points this season, 34.2 in PPR. That's an average of 3.4 or 6.8 in PPR. Michael hasn't been in much, so he's only had 4.7 fantasy points, 10 in PPR for an average of 1.5 or 3.5 in PPR. Neither have a recorded fumble. Chig has 34.4 receiving yards per game on average, while Michael Mayer has had 15.6 on average receiving yards per game. That does get brought down because of this week with 0, although he was targeted, and his best week with 38 in the first week. Chig has had his worst week in week 4 with 4 receiving yards, and his best week right before that with 66 receiving yards. For the next matchup, you have the Bengals going to Green Bay, where you have Green Bay very heavily favored on the money line with a spread of 14.5 and a total line of 44.5. The Bengals have a passing rank of 27. They're the worst rushing team in the league at a rank of 32. They have an allowed passing rank of 29 and an allowed rushing rank of 26. Green Bay has a passing rank of 10, a rushing rank of 17, an allowed passing rank of 15, and an allowed rushing rank of 3. The Bengals have 189.2 average passing yards per game and average 57 rushing yards per game. The Bengals have thrown 8 interceptions this season for an average of 1.6 per game and an average of 3 sacks suffered per game. Green Bay averages 250 passing yards per game, 114 rushing yards per game. Green Bay's had 1 interception this season, and they average 2 sacks suffered per game. The Bengals allow on average 270 passing yards per game and 132 rushing yards per game. Green Bay allows 121 passing yards per game and 77.5 rushing yards per game. The Bengals average 4.4 QB hits per game and 1 interception per game, giving them a total of 5 interceptions so far this season. And on average, they get 2 defensive sacks per game. Green Bay gets 8.7 QB hits per game on average, and average a half an interception per game, which gives them 2 defensive interceptions total this season, and they average 2.75 sacks per game. For the quarterbacks, you have Joe Flacco on the Bengals and Jordan Love for Green Bay. Flacco's had 25.9 fantasy points this season for an average of almost 6.5 fantasy points per game. Jordan Love's had 74.2 fantasy points this season for an average of 18.5 fantasy points per game. Joe Flacco's had 6 interceptions and 9 sacks suffered this season, with an additional 2 fumbles lost due to sacks. Jordan Love's had 1 interception with 8 sacks suffered this season, and he also lost a fumble. So on average, Joe Flacco gets 203.7 passing yards per game, which is a little higher than average for the team, and gets less than 5 rushing yards per game. Jordan Love averages the 250 passing yards per game and 15 rushing yards per game. Jordan Love had his best week last week with 337 passing yards, and his worst weeks have been around that mid-180s. Joe Flacco had his best week in week 1 with 290 passing yards, and his worst week was week 3 with 142 passing yards. Looking at our running backs for this game, you have Chase Brown on the Bengals and Josh Jacob on Green Bay. Chase Brown has 31.5 fantasy points, 49.5 in PPR. That's an average of 6.3 fantasy points, or 9.9 in PPR. Josh Jacobs has a total of 62.5 fantasy points, or 72.5 in PPR. That's an average of 15.6 fantasy points per game, or 18 in PPR. Both have had fumbles, but neither of them have given up a fumble. On average, Chase Brown gets 32 rushing yards per game and 19 receiving yards per game. Jacobs gets an average of 66.5 rushing yards per game and almost 30 receiving yards per game. Chase Brown has had a lot of games that average about that 45 range, in his worst week in week 3 with 3 rushing yards. Chase Brown has had pretty close to that mid-40 average, except for in week 3, where he had 3, and then last week with only 27 rushing yards. Josh Jacobs has had a couple good weeks with 84 and 86, and his worst week with only 30 rushing yards, and his worst week was week 3 with 30 rushing yards. Looking at the number 1 receivers for this game, you have Jamar Chase and you have Matthew Golden. Jamar Chase has had 54.3 fantasy points this season, 86.3 in PPR. That's an average of 10.8 fantasy points per game, or 17.3 in PPR. Matthew Golden's had 15.5 fantasy points this season, 26.5 in PPR. That's an average of 3.8 fantasy points per game, or 6.6 in PPR. The only turnover between these two comes from Jamar Chase as a receiving fumble. And looking at the averages, Jamar Chase gets almost 75 receiving yards on average per game, while Matthew Golden gets only 31 receiving yards per game. Jamar Chase's best week was week 2 with 165, but last week he also had 110 receiving yards. And his worst weeks were week 4 and week 1 with 26 and 23 receiving yards. For Matthew Golden, you've had a couple decent weeks now. That average was really brought down by week 2 with 0 receiving yards and week 1 with only 16. But he's had 52 and 58 in the last 2 games. This gives Jamar Chase easily the largest share on his team, closely followed by T. Higgins with his 31% there. Matthew Golden gets a little bit of the slice. I think that's about 15%, even though it's cut off there, but somewhere around there, so not near the 26 and 23s of some of the other more targeted players. And then we'll wrap this game up by looking at the tight ends, with Mike Gesicki being the Bengals starting tight end, and Tucker Kraft being the tight end for Green Bay. Mike Gesicki's only had 6 fantasy points this season, 14 in PPR, for an average of 1.2 or 2.8 in PPR. Tucker Kraft's had 34.8 fantasy points this season, 50.8 in PPR. That's an average of 8.7 or 12.7 in PPR. On average, Mike Gesicki only gets 12.2 receiving yards per game, while Tucker Kraft gets, on average, a little over 56 receiving yards per game. For Tucker Kraft, that average is really held up from week 2 with 124 receiving yards, and his worst week was right before that in week 1 with 16 receiving yards. While Gesicki over here doesn't get much more. He's never broken 20 receiving yards in a game yet, with his lowest being 6 and 8. And for our last 4 o'clock matchup, you have San Francisco at Tampa Bay. Here you have the Buccaneers favored on the money line with a spread of 3.5 and a total line of 47.5. San Francisco has a passing rank of 2, being the second best passing team in the league, a rushing rank of 28, an allowed passing rank of 13, and an allowed rushing rank of 16. Tampa Bay has a passing rank of 5, a rushing rank of 21, an allowed passing rank of 21, and an allowed rushing rank of 8. So that comes out to almost 300 passing yards per game on average for San Francisco, and 85 rushing yards on average per game. They do average an interception per game, giving them a total of 5 interceptions this season, and on average they take 1.5 sacks per game. For Tampa Bay, you have 256.6 passing yards per game and 110 rushing yards per game. You've had 1 passing interception this season, and on average they take just under 2 sacks per game. Defensively, San Francisco gives up 215.8 passing yards per game on average and 108 average rushing yards per game. Tampa Bay gives up 234.6 average passing yards per game and 92.4 average rushing yards per game. San Francisco defensively gets 2.6 QB hits per game and 1.2 sacks per game with no interceptions this season. Tampa Bay averages 5 QB hits per game and 2 sacks, and they've had a total of 2 interceptions this season. The quarterbacks in this game look to be Mac Jones, since you still have Purdy out, for San Francisco. And on Tampa Bay, you have Baker Mayfield. Mac Jones has had 57.2 fantasy points this season, which is an average of 19 fantasy points per game. Baker Mayfield's had 105.7 fantasy points this season for an average of 21.1 fantasy points per game. Mac Jones has had 1 passing interception this season and suffered 5 sacks. He's also lost a fumble due to a sack. Baker's had 1 passing interception this season with 9 sacks suffered, and Baker's had 1 passing interception this season and 9 sacks suffered. Mac Jones averages 301.6 passing yards per game and under 5 rushing yards per game. Baker Mayfield averages 256.6 passing yards per game and just under 30 rushing yards per game. Mac Jones has had 3 weeks here, starting after week 2 is his first week with 279 passing yards, and that was his worst week so far, with his best week being last week with 342 passing yards. Baker's worst week was week 1 with 167 passing yards, and since then he's just climbed every single game with 379 passing yards last game. For the running backs in this game, you have Christian McCaffrey on San Francisco, and you have Rachaad White filling in for Bucky Irving. Christian McCaffrey's had 84.9 fantasy points this season, 123.9 in PPR, which is an average of almost 17 fantasy points per game, or 24.8 in PPR. Rachaad White had 39.3 fantasy points this season, 51.3 in PPR, for an average of 7.8 fantasy points, or 10.2 in PPR. Neither running back has given up a fumble this season. And in the averages, you have Christian McCaffrey with an average of 56.4 rushing yards per game, and he averages 77.4 receiving yards per game. Rachaad White gets almost 30 rushing yards per game and averages 12.8 receiving yards per game. McCaffrey's best week was week 1 with 69 rushing yards. His worst week was week 4 with 49 rushing yards. But if we look closer into his receiving yards, because he gets a lot more in there, you have his worst week with week 2 with 52 receiving yards, and his best week in week 4 with 92 receiving yards. Otherwise, he had some high 80s and 70s. So he's never had less than 50 receiving yards, which is pretty good. For Rachaad White, he's had some low games, but that's because he's been kind of the backup. So you have the lowest in week 3 with 12 rushing yards, and the best in week 2 with 65 rushing yards, and last week filling in with 41 rushing yards. Also looking at his receiving yards, since he is a receiving back, week 4 he had 29, and then last week with 30 receiving yards, where you could see he was not utilized very much in the first 3 games. For our receivers in this game, you have Jennings, who's still listed as questionable, and you have Amika because Mike Evans is still listed as out, and Chris Godwin I have listed as out, even though I saw somewhere he might be in. So we'll just have to see that one. But I'll just look at these 2 for now. You have 20.9 fantasy points, 29.9 PPR for Jennings. That's an average of almost 7 fantasy points per game, or almost 10 in PPR. Amika has 77.4 fantasy points this season, 102.4 in PPR. That's an average of 15.5 fantasy points per game, or 20.5 in PPR. There are no turnovers between these 2. Jennings has an average of 43 receiving yards per game, while Amika averages 89 receiving yards per game. Jennings' best week was week 2 with 89 receiving yards, and his worst week was week 1 with 16 receiving yards, and last week he had 24 receiving yards. Amika's really been trending upward, with his worst week in week 2 with 29 receiving yards, but last week had 163 receiving yards as his most so far this season. That does give Amika the largest share on his team, But over here with the 49ers, your largest share comes from Ricky, who is listed as out for this game. And just going through the tight ends, you have Jake filling in still for Kittle, and you have Cade Otton on Tampa Bay. Jake's had 34.6 fantasy points this season, 53.6 in PPR. That's almost 7 fantasy points per game, or 10.7 in PPR. Otton's had 11.5 fantasy points this season, 21.5 in PPR. That's an average of almost 2.9 fantasy points per game, or 5.3 in PPR. There are no fumbles between these two. And if we look at the averages, you have Jake with 33.2 average receiving yards per game, and Otton has 28.75 receiving yards per game. Jake's worst week was in week 1 with 15 receiving yards, and his best week was week 4 with 58 receiving yards. Otton's worst week was week 1 with 0 receiving yards, but he also had a bad week 4 with 9 receiving yards, although he caught some footing last week with 81 receiving yards. And there you have that, everybody. That's the 4 o'clock games. If you enjoyed, leave a like and subscribe, and leave a comment on what else you'd want to see. And otherwise, thank you so much for watching.